So according to these calculations, over the past 20 years, we spent more than $700,000 on rent. And $700,000 in 20 years is basically a mortgage. So looking back, and maybe even with the benefit of hindsight, should have we done anything differently? Are we happy that we decided to spend this money on rent rather than buying a house? Let's discuss. So there are lots of reasons why people may want to own a place, but if we go back to the very basics, the main reason to own a place is for shelter. Back in the days, having shelter could have meant not being eaten alive by a tiger during the night. Now, over time, we've attached lots of additional value and meanings and complications even to owning a place. But going back to the core, that's it. It's for shelter. And owning a place, or maybe even renting a place, renting a house, is not even the only way you could live your life. There are people now who live in cars and vans. Or there was a story, which I found very interesting, of that German lady who sold everything in her late 70s and started living on a cruise ship. So she doesn't own a place anymore, she doesn't own a house anymore. In exchange for that, she's got some living quarters on a cruise ship, and she's very happy. She's got everything around her, activities, she's taken care of. She's got a doctor available 24 hours a day without owning a house. So there are additional situations, but let's take this thing for granted. Shelter is the first thing. And then there are additional reasons why we may want to own a place. One of the most important is the long-term financial return. So let's explore that. So the financial return of owning a house is probably one of the most tempting reasons why people decide to buy. They want to build equity over time, and as they pay back their mortgage, hopefully their investment will grow in value, providing them with a profit if they decide to sell the place. Fair enough, I don't think there is anything wrong with that idea of building an investment over time. However, there are a few considerations that I'd like to make. The first one is about sacrifices. So, in order to make a profit from a house, you need to do one of two things, potentially both of them. The first one is to buy low and sell high. So you buy a property at a low price, hoping to sell it at a higher price later on. And the second is to minimize the amount you spend in interest. So let's analyze them one by one. The first element, buy low and sell high, usually means that you need to buy a place in maybe an up-and-coming area. And the best investments are actually made on areas that really require a lot of improvement to be gentrified, to become a better place. And I've got friends who decided to go down that route. They paid a low-ish amount of money to buy a place in an area that was a bit rough. And it is true that after a few years they sold it for a profit. However, I think that, in my mind at least, that doesn't compensate the fact that they were scared to go back home at night. So there is always that, if you buy in an up-and-coming area, you basically decide to invest in an area, in a property, that's probably not the exact property you would like to live in. So for the sake of the investment, you basically make some sacrifices. The other side of it is the amount of interest you pay. The best situation for you is to have a mortgage which is as little as you can and as short as you can, so that you don't end up paying lots of interest. On a 30-year mortgage on $500,000, for example, you end up paying almost $300,000 in interest. This is money that goes to your bank, doesn't build any equity in your house. And if you shorten the mortgage by 10 years to 20 years, that amount of interest reduces to $200,000, which is a lot. So people normally end up making sacrifices to pay their mortgage more quickly or to put down as much as they can in a deposit, which normally means then they have to really cut down on expenses. I've got friends who decided to put down a lot, pretty much everything they had on a deposit, and then they had some very difficult years at the beginning because they couldn't afford to do anything else, and they really relied on their stable income from work to pay the mortgage. But it's a very risky situation to be in. I also have some friends who really committed to very short mortgages in order to pay less interest, and now they really struggle month by month with their expenses, and they had to cut on travels, they had to cut on purchases and so on in order to be able to afford the mortgage. Some people also say that a mortgage forces them to save. I've got friends who did exactly that. They said, I'm not able to save money for myself, so the mortgage at least gives me an excuse, or maybe even forces me to save money. But these are the same people that weren't able to save money and now really struggle to pay back the mortgage because, moving from I'm saving 0 per month to moving to I need to save 3,000 per month and pay a mortgage is a big, big jump, let alone putting down as much as they could in deposits to minimize those payments. The other way to examine this thing is by using research papers. And there are plenty of them, which provide you with interesting ways to see the data. For example, this paper here suggests that what people experience in life in terms of raising prices, high inflation, and so on, determines whether they want to own a place or not. So a 1% increase in inflation, for example, generates a 6% increase of people buying houses, which is like making future decisions based on past performances, expecting that those past performances will replicate and continue in the future, which is probably never a good idea. Also, there is plenty of data comparing the return over the long term of the stock market versus real estate. And I've got to say, many of these charts show that the stock market performs better over the long term. However, I'm also conscious that you can slice the data in any way you want, and you could probably demonstrate exactly the opposite by taking specific periods of time. Buying a house at this specific point and selling it at that specific point could have provided you with a better outcome. My overall point is that even if we cannot determine which one is best, at least we could agree on the fact that there is no clear winner using this strategy. So buying a house is not necessarily a better financial decision. Looking at the data, it's probably not a better financial decision, but we can agree that there is no conclusive evidence. And in fact, even this paper here suggests exactly that people make these decisions based on what they feel is the right thing to do, what they feel would give them the highest return, instead of considering the actual facts. They say the findings of that research shows that there is still a large perception based on stereotypes rather than considering the facts that buying is a better option than renting. So overall, what is this telling us? This is telling us that buying a house because of the financial return, the financial value, is not a good decision. This shouldn't be a factor in your decision simply because there is no certainty around the outcome. So let's move on to the next potential reasons for owning a place. The next area is about pride of ownership and maybe community ties. For some people, buying a place, especially in a specific area, could be a status symbol. It could be that they want to put some roots in a specific area. It could be that they want to be part of that community. And it's true that maybe people who own places tend to stay in a local community for longer than people renting. There is also another element which is more internal. Living in the same place, maybe even as a kid, growing up in the same place, gives you lots of positive memories and positive vibes. However, the flip side is that at some point, when the time comes, when your parents are not there anymore, and maybe your life is somewhere else, so you will have to dispose of that house, that will also give you lots of emotional problems. It's going to be tough to do it. So, on balance, I'm thinking, for a long number of years, I thought that having grown up in the same place was giving me lots of good things, which was true. At the same time, now I realize that it will also going to give me lots of pain when the time comes that I will have to do something with a house. So in a way, living in the same place and raising kids in the same place, you should be conscious that at some point you're going to give your kids the responsibility to deal with this situation, selling a house, deciding what to do with it, which may be tough for them. Now, talking about kids, let's move on to the next series of reasons that in theory should support owning a place, which is around leaving something to your kids, creating value for them. Many people, and I consider this to be some sort of a personal dogma in a way, when we have discussions around, okay, why did you decide to buy? One of the main things that they say is that I want to take care of my kids. I want to make sure that if something happens, they have a roof over their heads. And I want to make sure that I leave them with something. So this thing about kids plays a big part in a decision, especially of a young family, to buy a place instead of renting. And I think that in many cases, this attention is actually misplaced. Let me explain. So the idea that if something really bad happens, at least my kids will have a roof over their heads, I can't really understand. I mean, I can understand the maybe the feeling which is behind this, but from a practical perspective, there are two very different assumptions there which are in contradiction. So these very young parents, with the idea of doing something good for their kids when they are maybe 2, 3, 4 years old, they take a mortgage with this idea that if something goes wrong, at least there is a house for them. The problem is, if something goes horribly wrong, maybe when the kids are 5 or 10, even owning the place, which will have been half paid maybe by the time, but that's a different story, doesn't really give the kids anything because they won't be able to live there, right? They will probably with their grandparents or in a different accommodation. So having the house doesn't really change anything. If the really bad thing should happen when the mortgage is being paid, then the kids will be 30 years old and they will be probably living already somewhere else, maybe have a family. So again, that roof over their heads is not there anymore in general. So there is this contradictory thinking, which is if something really bad happens, then I'll do this, which assumes that for the duration of the mortgage, it's not going to happen. That really bad thing is not going to happen. But then it can happen when the mortgage is being paid. So 30 years down the line. From that perspective, I think this doesn't make sense to me. And it'd be much better to buy insurance for your kids so that if something happens to you, then they will get the money. And with that money, they can do whatever they want if they're big enough, or the person that will take care of them can do something for them using that money. The next big reason why people tend to buy a place, or at least that's what they mention as the potential reason, is that they want to build something for their kids. They want to be able to leave them something, an asset, some inheritance, something of value. What is the problem with this? It's a great idea, but there is a problem. And the problem is with our life expectancy. In practical terms, your kids will get the house or the money or whatever you want to leave them when you die, when they are 50 or 60. And when they are 60, there isn't really much they can do with the money or with a house. Yes, it would be nice to have, of course, but when they are 60, they're very likely to have their own family, their own house, their own life in general. And you will be adding to something that they already have. But there is a better way of doing things. And if you've read a book, for example, like Die with Zero, there is a very good point that the author makes, which is the best moment to give your kids some money or some assets or some value is when they can use it to build their own memories, their own experiences, and in general, the foundations of what they're going to do later in life. So, from a practical perspective, that means that giving money to your kids when they are 20 or 30 is way better than leaving them with more money and potentially more assets when they are 60. Because at that point, they're not really going to use them. But when they are 20 or 30, they can do lots of things with whatever money you can leave them with. So these objections, I want to give them a roof over their heads if something goes bad, or I want to leave them with something when I die and so on, they feel more like personal convictions, almost personal dogmas, rather than something which is based on actual facts and actual benefits. Another one that I can think of is something that I think 90% of people tells me when we have these conversations. There is this dislike of paying someone else's mortgage. I want to own, I want to buy because I don't want to rent and pay someone else's mortgage. But that's a very negative way of looking at these things. So imagine when you go and buy some bread. You pay for your bread, you take the bread, you don't think that the profit that the baker makes is then going to be used to pay the baker's mortgage, right? You don't think that, and you shouldn't. He's entitled to use that profit in whichever way he wants. It would be a very negative way of looking at things to believe, to think that your money is going to be used to pay a mortgage. And the same applies to your rental accommodation. You shouldn't think that your rent is used to pay someone else's mortgage. You should look at things from a more positive viewpoint. Just as when you get your bread, you should be thinking, I'm spending some money to get some delicious bread and I'm going to enjoy eating it. When you're renting a place, Your thinking should be, I'm spending money so that I can enjoy my freedom and my flexibility. I'm paying for those things. I'm not paying someone else's mortgage. The next one is stability and control. It is true that owning a place gives you more leeway if you want to make modifications, especially big modifications. If you want to decorate the way you want, you've got more control over the property. And also, you've got more stability because there is no one that can actually evict you. There are no terms on the lease that will force you out in specific situations. So when you own a place, you are sort of guaranteed that you're going to be able to stay there unless and until you want to move, which is a fair point. Now, just a few considerations on this. This is something that I see fairly often. This fear of eviction is mentioned as one of the main reasons why people want to buy. I don't want to be kicked out by the landlord. And although I understand the stability concern, that people want to be able to stay in a place for a long term, I don't really get why a landlord may want to kick them out. From a landlord's perspective, what they want is reliable tenants that live in a place normally without destroying it and paying on time. So if you are one of those tenants, you pay on time and you live in a property normally as if it was yours, then why would a landlord kick you out? If anything, they will probably do anything in their power to keep you there if you're not happy, because it's so difficult to find good tenants these days. It is also true that if you think of the situation from the other perspective, so let's say you own the place and at some point you want to leave. Maybe you've got new neighbors who are really unfriendly, really loud, really obnoxious. What do? You've given up that flexibility to simply give your notice, and you have to maybe sell the place and maybe wait for months until you can finally monetize the house and find a new one to move to. So there is a flip side to this thing about stability. Yes, it is true you may stay in a place for a long period of time if you own it, but it's also true that if you want to leave, then that may not be that quick and easy. Talking about control, the other thing is freedom to upgrade, and I totally get it. When the place is yours, you can make any improvement you want, from knocking down walls, redecorating, adding an extension, maybe even putting a pool in your living room. You can do whatever you want because the house is yours, and you can't if you're simply renting. There is a flip side to this, which my friend who owns places always tell me about, which is that when you own, you're constantly looking for improvements to make to the place. Buying new furniture, changing the decoration in specific rooms, buying new things, changing the plumbing system. So the ability to change things comes at a cost. The last thing that relates to stability and control is stability of costs. There is this idea that you don't control the rent you pay, and so the landlord could come to you out of the blue and ask for a raise, provided that the lease allows him to do that. While at the same time, you can control perfectly the amount of repayments that you pay every month, which is partially true. Especially if you have a fixed rate mortgage, you know exactly how much you're going to pay per month for the next 20 years. And you can place everything into an Excel file and you know exactly where you stand from now to the next 20 years. However, I feel, and based on conversation with friends, that a majority of people, at least mentally, compare rent with repayments without giving any consideration to the fact that there could be unforeseeable costs on the house that you will have to pay. The washing machine breaks if you're renting the place, and depending on your lease, it may be down to the landlord to change it and replace it for you. But if you own the place, that cost is on you. Let alone major things such as a roof leaking or the plumbing system not working anymore. I know that you can insure against these things, and you should probably, it's a good idea, but not many people compare repayments plus insurance to the cost of rent. They seem to be comparing rent and repayments only, which only gives you a partial picture of that stability of costs. So back to the original question. $700,000 later and 20 years later, was renting the right decision? Even with the benefit of hindsight, would I do something different if I could go back? In the past 20 years, we lived in Italy, we lived in the UK, in London for almost 15 years, then we lived in Spain, and then we're back in Italy. And we could only do that because of the freedom and flexibility that we had from renting a place. We had several places, especially in London, all of them nice, some of them very nice, and we realized that when we had some friends over and we noticed that they were taking selfies on the terrace. Those places we couldn't have afforded if we wanted to buy them, but we could afford renting them. And we could just move to different places in town depending on our job location, or even internationally, as I said, when we had enough of London and we wanted a slightly different life. All of these things because we were renting. And I really believe that paying for my freedom and flexibility was, and still is, the right thing to do. So that's my answer. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and thank you very much for watching.